So what stats stay the same? What stats change? What can we rely upon? Well, we can rely on Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NBA fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I cram fun down your throat. I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free and we are available on all platforms. So sign up, double bang, thumb it up. Starting tomorrow, we're going to have the series that I've done every year for at least the last 5 years, where I get a beat reporter on that covers the local team from the Locked On Podcast Network, and we talk about the team. We're not going to go through and go, oh, who do you think is going to be a good fantasy option? Because that's not what that person knows about. That's not what they talk about, and who cares, right? You don't want to hear somebody's opinion who isn't interested in fantasy basketball about that stuff. What we do is we get them on, and we talk about the team. And we ask questions that we need to know before we make our determinations of player values, of rankings, ADPs, draft strategies. And then, once we hit into September, I go through and I do a fantasy-specific team preview. Who are the sleepers? Who are the busts? Who's got good value? Who can do this? Blah, blah, blah. All that sort of stuff. So this is the process that we've used year upon year upon year to get into our minds how to approach the upcoming season. We talk about base sort of strategies. We talk about the overall idea of the team, because as much as we're playing fantasy, real life matters. The real life value of the team. What are they trying to do? Who are they going to play? Who are they prioritizing? What are the lineups? What are the rotations? What is the coach going to do differently? All that stuff is important, and then we bring all that into our fantasy value, and it's all a crescendo as we bring up towards draft day, hopefully, at some point in October. So that'll start tomorrow. Now, there will be other shows interspersed amongst those team previews, but that is what's coming up over the next few weeks. Today is one of those other foundation groundwork type shows. It's a show that I've done almost every year. And not almost every year, because it's not something that I did at the start, because it is something that, and again, I don't have the flexibility for this, but I'm here to toot my own horn. But I brought this sort of discussion and this sort of thinking, I believe, into the fantasy basketball space, talking about the way that stats correlate. Now, one of the first things I did was talking about the interstat correlations, which I'll explain what that is in a second. That's not what we're doing today, but that is one of the correlations you can talk about. And I'm not going to do that show because we know the results of that. If you have high assists, you have high turnovers. It's as simple as that. If you have high points, you have high turnovers. We know where the correlations lie. If you have high minutes, you have high fantasy points. If you have high usage, you have high fantasy points. If you have high assists, you have moderate steals. Like there's weak and all that stuff stays the same. One of the other correlations you can do is game to game. And I've done that work as well. And all of this leads into the formula that I use for Durant ranking for head-to-head leagues. Because all of this stuff is important. We've talked at length about the downfalls of Z-scores, standard scores, of the way you rank players. We've talked about the downfall of that because, again, the game is a head-to-head game for the most part. It is not the majority of people playing roto. It is a small percentage of people playing roto, and it's a different story. So there's got to be a way that we factor in the randomness, the variance, the changes. Game-to-game variance is something that is important, but that is also not what we're covering. Although, most of the findings that we have, not 100%, but a lot of the findings we have as a general shape of the idea, will cover game-to-game stuff. But what we're looking at is year-to-year stickiness. Year-to-year correlations, if you want to use the correct mathematical term. What stats from one year to the next stay the same? What ones can we rely upon? And again, this stuff, all these numbers are factored into the Durant rankings because you will hear this. And I am sure, and I try not to, but I am sure that I am guilty of this at times as well. This is why we do this, right? Because you will hear somebody, whether that is somebody like me or it is me on a podcast, writing an article. It could be your mates. It could be on a Reddit forum. It could be on a comment section. They'll say, well, this guy is good at this. This guy will get you 1.8 steals. This guy will hit you 50% from the field. Well, he's actually a good free throw shooter. All right? You'll hear that. And what are they referencing? Literally what happened last season. That's it, right? Because that's how our brains work. We saw it. We saw Jalen Duren go from an 80% guy to a 70% guy free throw line. Or the other way around. I can't remember which one it was, whatever. But like whatever happened most recently, we look at it and go, well, he gets you good percentages. Okay. But does he? But will he? Will it always happen? That's what I want to find out. Because, and again, we've done this every year, and I'm going to add a few other numbers into this year that we haven't always done, but I think it's important as well. What numbers are actually real? What numbers are actually sticky? So when we sit back and look at a player and go, well, he actually got us 2 steals a game, so if I get that, I'll lock down steals. I think you know where this is going. That doesn't mean that it happens. It doesn't mean that it continues in perpetuity. It doesn't mean that it happens year on year. But for some numbers, it does. It gives you you got a pretty good idea of some things, how they're going to play out. So what did I do? You look at the numbers from the 24-25 season, look at the numbers from the 23-24 season as well. Yep, year to year. They're as simple as that. Obviously, if somebody didn't play in one of those years, their data is not taken into the database because how can I correlate that? And that even goes for when we talk about games played, another one we're going to talk about. I'm not even including someone who missed an entire season. I've taken out of the data anybody who played fewer than 15 games in one of those 2 seasons. So again, when we're talking games played, I've actually removed someone who played under 15 games. And what I did is I looked at the top 250 players from a head-to-head perspective last season and used their data. I didn't go all 500 players deep. I'm using the top 250 players to determine year-to-year correlation. Now, for those of you who are mathematically inclined, I'm doing this with using R numbers, the Pearson coefficient. For those of you who don't know what that is, you see a graph, Y, x-axis, and you see dots plotted on it. If you have a perfect linear regression line, trend line, that is a 45-degree perfect line, that is an R coefficient of +1, meaning that everything that happens on the y-axis, which is 24-25 season, is 100% influenced by what happened the year before. If you shot 50% from the field in 24-25, that's because you shot 50% from the field in 23-24. Although I should rephrase that. It's about correlation, not causation. So if we got an R of 1, it would tell us that whatever the number you got in 23-24 is, that is the same number that you got in 24-25. So obviously we know nobody is getting a 1. There's no category that's giving a 1, right? A -1 would be the inverse. So instead of a straight line going from the bottom of the graph, bottom left up to top right, it would go from top left down to bottom right, meaning the higher one number goes, like when you compare assists to turnovers, the higher, or not assists to turnovers, assist to turnover fantasy value. The higher one number goes, the lower the other one goes. Anything that is above a 0.5 correlation is considered a strong correlation, meaning the influence of those things is pretty high. Anything that's below like a 0.4 is pretty weak. And anything that's a positive means there's a positive relationship, and negative means obviously inverse relationship. So, we're going to go through a bunch of stats, the standard fantasy stats. We're going to talk about other stats as well that influence fantasy. We're going to talk about total, like per game numbers, but we're also going to talk about rate stats, percentages. Because again, then we look at, okay, what is the actual influence of minutes on this versus the actual skill level of a player? I hope all that makes sense. And again, why is it important? Because when we look at someone, this is where, again, really drill this into our heads. When we look at a player and we go, well, they're going to give you this because that's what they did last season, think back to these numbers and go, oh, yeah, but how much trust should I put on it? It's not to say that it won't happen because none of this is 100%. We're looking at a sample of 250 players. And just because there's a correlation of 0.9 for the stat doesn't mean that every player has a 0.9 correlation, meaning it's going to give you, it doesn't mean that. It means when we're talking generalities, and we love a generality, and then we dig down to an individual player. But if we start with a generality, if we start with an idea of like, this is the overall idea, the shape behind this stat, and then we dig into individual circumstances and teams, we can get a better idea of not 100% what we can expect, but what we can rely upon, or more importantly, what we shouldn't overly invest in. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through and hopefully explain that out to you. Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Do you ever wish that managing your money felt easier with Monarch Money? It can. You can be growing your savings, you can be planning a big purchase, whatever it is. Monarch puts you into the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. I'm sure if Monarch Money did something regarding fantasy basketball, they would use this planning ability and they'd look at correlations and go, hey, don't like overinvest in something like this where it's pretty like wonky year to year. It gives you those insights, those ideas about your budgeting, your planning, so you're able to build wealth for you and your family. And it's a great way if you're sharing finances with someone. You can, in Monarch, you can track all of that and be able to keep all of that stuff all in one spot so you can see and keep each other in line, on track, and keep an idea of where the budget is going. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That is monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. I was doing that ad read, and I was realizing that sometimes that, I don't know if you realize, I've got like an Australian accent. It's relatively thick. I don't know if you guys watch this. I did, this here, sidebar, Below Deck. And not Below Deck Mediterranean, just original Below Deck where they're down in the Caribbean. And the captain of the boat, Captain Kerry, is Australian. And I watch that show, and I'm Australian, and I've got an accent. And sometimes the way that guy talks, sorry, what did he say? What? The thickest accent I reckon I've ever heard. And of course, like I found out he's from Queensland. Shout out to everyone from Queensland. It makes sense that you can't understand what he's saying. But when you hear him talk, the players going harder, the primary's going, it's going to be a real tough time. I'm sorry, Kerry? What was that? Yeah, it's primary's going harder. Everyone like kitchen warring together and deckhands and the bosun. Thanks, Kerry. Anyway, I hope my accent's not as hard to understand as old mate Captain Kerry. And I hope that I'm articulating things a little bit better than the big fella from Queensland. Now, what are we talking about again? Definitely not Below Deck. Although, if you want to talk Below Deck, get into the comments below. We'll maybe have a bit of a chat about the the issues with the staff. Whatever. We're talking correlations. We're talking year-to-year stickiness of fantasy stats. Well, not even fantasy stats, NBA stats, and what we can rely upon. Now, I did 20 individual categories, and the vast majority of them are relatively sticky, which is great news for us. It's great news for us. The strongest stickiness, and this is a category I've never done before, is looking at percentages. Not percentages, like rate statistics. Offensive rebound percentage, which is a percentage of the available offensive rebounds you grab when you're on the court. So again, it's not minutes related. That is the stickiest number that we have. A 0.94. That is as close to 1 as we got out of all the 20 categories that I looked at. Meaning, if somebody is a good offensive rebounder, they are a good offensive rebounder. And again, we all know that everything in the NBA and the talent is about two things. Can you do the thing? And do you have the opportunity to do the thing? So, if you can offensive rebound, you offensive rebound. And you do it at a very similar rate. This is also, these are numbers, remember. It doesn't tell you if a player is good offensive rebounder. It doesn't say that. It just says, was their offensive rebound percentage basically identical year on year? And yes, it was. So the quality or the ability of them to be an offensive rebounder stayed the same. Defensive rebound percentage is also the second highest one, 0.92. So rebounding on either end, incredibly stable. When players are on the court, they are going to grab rebounds. At whatever rate they grab them, they will do it at a similar level. So we should have a high level of trust, and this is the numbers that we've gotten in the past, a high level of trust in rebounding stats staying similar. Very intriguing to see this one, because blocks, as we know, blocks are a low volume category. Now this is where year to year and game to game differs. Year-to-year stats on blocks, and you'll see on the screen if you're watching this, that block percentage was the amount of shots, or the percentage of shots that you block when you're on the court, versus blocks per game, which is just the raw number of blocks. They're both really highly correlated. 0.92 for block percentage, 0.91 for blocks per game. So if someone is a good shot blocker, they are a good shot blocker. Now, the difference there in game-to-game stats is that because blocks are a low-volume number, you can have one good number, above average for fantasy, or you can block 0. You can't block half a shot in a game. So you can have a week where you get 4-0-0, Or you could have a week where you go 1-1-1, yet the 4-0-0 is better because you got 4 over 3 games instead of 3. But what if that split of games happens and there's a Sunday in the middle there, and then it splits into different weeks, and there's an unreliability with that. But as a general rule, block percentage, a player's shot blocking ability, year to year, stays pretty similar. And the thing you can see there that where it's 0.92 block percentage and 0.91 blocks per game means that the minutes that a player get aren't really influencing it a huge amount. Those players are getting the minutes that they get. They're not as up and down. So like, I'll talk about this when we get to steals later on, because obviously steals and blocks are really heavily not related, but we talk about them a lot thanks to that infernal term stocks, the worst term in fantasy basketball, right? We talk about steals and blocks together all the time. But as a reality, there's a similarity, but also there's a lot of differences. The similarity is the defensive stats, and the other similarity is they are low volume, where it's a 0, a 1, a 2, right? And we know that there can be a lot of variance there. Blocks, year on year, they stay about the same. You don't expect much change there. Whether it's block percentage or blocks per game, they stay the same. What about some other strong ones? I find it really interesting that in all of these that I did, that where we talk about the percentage stat, like block percentage, rebound percentage, assist percentage, the correlation for all of those numbers is higher than the per game number. And that makes sense because the per game number requires minutes. You need to have consistent minutes to keep your block percentage and your blocks per game the same. But the difference isn't huge. And as you'll see with assists, assist percentage 0.90, assists per game 0.90. So we're talking 3 decimal points difference, or down to the 3rd decimal point in terms of the difference between those numbers. So again, if someone's a good assist player, as a general rule, they will remain a good assist player. Now, we are working down the list here in terms of what is more highly correlated versus what is less highly correlated. But these are still high. Now, obviously, what we want to target when we're talking about fantasy, when we're looking at production of players and making draft picks, because a lot of where this information comes, is we know what he's going to hold. So what do we want to find? We want to find players where situation and opportunity is vastly different. For example, we'll talk about assists. Andrew Nembhard is probably going to be the Pacers' starting point guard. Last season, he was the Pacers' starting shooting guard. Therefore, he will be, like if we're talking, this is not how this works, but let me just use this as a rough estimation. If you've got an assist percentage of R equals 0.90, again, this is not how this works, but I think this analogy helps to simplify it a little bit. Again, this is not how it works. Statisticians, this is not how it works. But there is an ability to sort of use this as a simplified way. If I say that an assist percentage is R equals 0.90, again, not how it works. 90% of people might have the same assist numbers year on year. 10% might not. That's what it actually means is that the variance in these numbers is 90% accounted for by what the player did the year before, and there's 10% external factors. That's really what it means, but whatever, right? So when we're talking about these numbers, actually that's not even true because that's the R squared. My bad. I'm confusing mathematical what do you call it? Foundational sort of ideas and trying to simplify, but I'm doing a bad job of it. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is Nembhard going from shooting guard to point guard is going to have a positive improvement in his assists, almost certainly. All right, we can look at most players' assists, and if they're in a relatively similar spot, we can have again, not how it works, but like a 90% degree of confidence that they're still going to be good at assists. Somebody like a Nembhard should rise up. And then when we go to do this next season, Nembhard's assists should fall down. And we know by isolating those specific scenarios where the outliers are. Expecting somebody in the same situation to just randomly add 2.5 assists to their game or bump their assist percentage from 25 to 35 is just not a realistic thing unless there are certain circumstances around it because the numbers are relatively sticky. Rebounds. We already talked about offensive and defensive rebounding percentage being incredibly sticky. Rebounds per game, also really sticky, 0.90. Usage rate. This one's interesting, 0.9 as well. So a player's usage, actually relatively sticky. But again, much like when talking about assists, we when we're trying to find the value players, the risers, the sleepers, even the guys that are busts, who are the guys where situation determines that they are in the small amount of people who don't fit the sticky model, where they might have a big jump or a big drop. But as a general rule, usage stays pretty similar. So does scoring. Points per game has an R of 0.90. You score 20 a game, you're probably going to be around that mark most years. And we've talked about this, we did it a lot last season in fantasy. It's about how do you hit the big value? How much did you love drafting Dyson Daniels? Ivica Zubats, they won you your league. Great. The year before, Jalen Johnson, he won you your league. Great. Why? Because he did stuff that others weren't expecting and took a gigantic leap forward. He didn't just do the same thing. Getting guys who do the same thing, important, very important. Very important. But finding the guys who are in a space to break that is also very important. And that's part of what we're going to do all through this off-season, pre-season, in finding those guys. Got a little bit more to talk about. First of all, though, today's episode is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. It is time to fuel up and to turn it up with 5 Hour Energy Transfusion. It brings the bold grape, ginger, and lime flavor of your favorite golf drink, minus the alcohol, into a quick, energizing shot, whether you're sinking birdies or just making memories with friends. This one's a hole-in-one, that's a golf thing, for your energy game. Sometimes when you're on the course or even off it, you just need an extra boost to stay sharp and energized. Me, bad at golf, terrible at golf. When I've been playing, how many times have I even hit the green like off a tee shot in a par 3? Like, not many. But when you do, it's a great feeling. You love it. Right? It's a fluke, but you love that feeling. But sometimes you're just not feeling it. You don't have that little bump that you need. And that is where 5 Hour Energy Transfusion can really come in. So if you go to 5hourenergy.com today, that is the number 5hourenergy.com, you can use my promo code LOCKEDONGOLF to receive 20% off your order. The offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders. So whether you're meeting up with friends or trying to turn 18 holes into 36, get the energizing boost that you need to power through. Order transfusion-flavored 5 Hour Energy shots today. All right, let's talk about the rest of these correlations, because we've talked about a bunch that are pretty sticky, right? We've talked about a lot that are pretty sticky. That doesn't mean all of them are, and I think, again, you know where this is going to go. I've got a bunch more that are relatively strong, not in the 90s, but 3-pointers per game has an R of 0.87, right? We feel relatively confident about someone's 3-point ability. Assist to turnover ratio, not something I've ever looked at before. 0.84. Again, a relatively strong correlation. Pretty unlikely that someone turns a bad assist to turnover ratio into an extremely good one. Not impossible, but not likely. Or vice versa. Field goal percentage. Now we're getting interesting. 0.83. Still considered a strong correlation. R equals 0.83 for field goal percentage. Some of the biggest things, and this is exactly what we're talking about here, some of the biggest things that determine a player bust, player being a sleeper, or a player being an absolute surprise breakout is weird, unpredictable shooting spikes or falling off a cliff. So what we're looking at here is that out of all of the percentages, field goals, 3-pointers, 2-pointers, and free throws, the one that does stay the same the most is field goal percentage. So when we're talking about the ability of a category to go back and forward, you should have more confidence in field goal percentage. You can try and predict who's going to be a breakout guy in terms of shooting. It's very much not easy to do, but when you're talking overall field goal percentage, it's relatively, like, if a player's a high field goal guy, they're a high field goal guy. But as we also know, 66 down to 60, still both very good, but very big difference in the way that they impact your team. Steal percentage. Still considered strong. Like, I'm considering anything over an R of 0.75 to be a strong correlation. Steal percentage, 0.78. Yes? Now, compare and contrast to blocks, which is up at 0.92. Steal percentage varies more. It's still considered a strong number. But what you will also notice is that when I did blocks and block percentage and blocks per game, we saw block percentage and blocks per game right next to each other. 0.92, 0.91. They are both the same. Steal percentage and steals per game are not the same. Now, I don't know the exact reason for this, but here's a hypothesis. Teams value rim protection. So if someone is a good rim protector, that player will play as a rim protector. Correct? Other issues they may have with their game. Lack of shooting, no hands, Rudy Gobert style, whatever it is, no offense, no passing. But you've got a skill. Here's your skill. It's protecting the rim. So you'll play your minutes, you'll do your thing, and you'll block your shots at the same rate, but you'll also be on the court for a similar amount. The discrepancy for me, again, hypothesis, not testing it, can't, no idea. I'm not interviewing coaches to find this. But the difference between steal percentage and steals per game in terms of correlation is that, yes, steal percentage, there's some flukiness involved in that. Steal percentage requires the other team sometimes to throw bad passes. But the difference between steal percentage and steals per game is that coaches do not value that type of defense as much as they value rim protection. So you might be a really good steals guy, but if you can't shoot, Matisse Thybulle, but if you can't pass, if you can't do anything and make good decisions, your ability to generate steals won't necessarily guarantee you consistent minutes year on year or game on game. Again, complete hypothesis. But that's what I think the difference is between steal percentage, which might stay the same, versus steals per game, which is not as consistent. Turnover percentage, the percentage of players that you turn the ball over, is still relatively strong, but it's down to 0.77. Again, you know my thoughts on turnovers in terms of evaluating players. It's relatively sticky, but way less than everything else that we've covered off so far. And that brings us to the ones that are more moderate. Minutes per game. Now, minutes per game is not a fantasy category, but it's the category that influences every fantasy category. It has a correlation of 0.74. Okay, so again, we know that. We know that that means that the majority of players, their minutes are relatively the same. But we're talking about a scenario here where more players are going to have minutes variations versus in some of those other stats that we've talked about already. So when we're talking about a player that played 30 minutes the year before, context becomes really important there. Were they on a bad team? Were a bunch of guys injured? Will they play more? Will they play less? Moderate correlation on minutes per game. 2-point percentage, 0.7. We're getting into how do we trust this? And again, we talked about field goal percentage being steady, which I find interesting, like a strong correlation, because 2-pointers are at 0.7 and 3-pointers are at 0.67. Again, that's getting towards weak. It's moderate, but it's getting towards weak for 3-point percentage. The interesting thing is that field goal percentage as a general number stays more consistent. So is it that if someone has a bump in threes, they have a drop in twos? That's what that's telling me, is that if your threes go up, your twos might go down in order to keep that field goal percentage more stable, which is interesting. I don't really know why that would be, but that's interesting. But also, again, we also know that 3-pointers made per game is relatively sticky year on year, but 3-point percentage is not. That's an interesting development. And we also know that 3-point percentage is it's the hidden killer. It's the one that influences 3 standard fantasy categories. 3-pointers made, field goal percentage, and scoring. Yet it's not a category that we track for the most part. And as we can see here, it is one of the weakest correlations that we have. Out of the 20 stats that I did, 3-point percentage is the 19th in terms of correlation. And that, being the most influential category, really outside of minutes, should set off some alarm bells to you. That 3-point percentage is a little bit, it's not completely, but it's a little bit all over the shop. And because it influences multiple categories, and again, we can talk about this. We talked about points being stable and 3-pointers being stable in their correlation. Field goal percentage being somewhat stable. But the fact that 3-pointers aren't, is that the reason that those things aren't even more stable? Probably. So, the two that have always shown up to be the least stable or the least relevant or the least consistent year on year are steals and free throw percentage. And it is the same again. 0.67 for steals per game, 0.67 for free throw percentage. So somebody, he's going to kill your free throws. He's a punt free throw guy. He's a really good free throw shooter. No. Maybe, but also no. You cannot, the reason I want to bring this to your attention, you cannot say that with confidence as a broad sweeping rule. Now, I feel good about saying Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, Jordan Poole, just to name 3 names. All former Warriors, or some of them former Warriors, one of them current. They're going to be close to 90% from the line. Luke Kennard, going to be pretty good from the line. Pretty good, right? He's a good shooter. I know they're going to be 90%-ish. But if somebody's got a track record of being up and down in percentages, being up and down in free throw percentage, I would beg you not to say, well, I guess he's figured it out. Oh, I guess he's a bad shooter now. Nah. We should have skepticism. Again, reiterate this point. This does not mean that if you were bad at free throws, you've got a chance that all of a sudden become good. Or if you're good, you're going to become bad. It just means put less trust in the number. What you saw last season, you should look at it and go, okay, but what if it isn't? And it's, again, not to say you don't use it. It's to say don't base your thoughts, don't base your team build, don't base your evaluations on something that happened in this category last season. And the same thing goes for steals. I already gave my reason why I think steal percentage and steals per game is widely different. But steals per game is a big one. Think about this when you're deciding to draft Dyson Daniels in round 2. I'm not saying that Dyson Daniels is going to be bad at steals. He might be the outlier that keeps the numbers really good. But also remember this, he wasn't that good the year before. His steal percentage wasn't even as high as it was this season. It is very possible for Dyson Daniels to lead the league in steals and still get you 0.6 steals fewer per game. That is totally a possible thing. And we have seen it year over year over year. And OG Anunoby gets you 2 and then 1.4. All right, still good, but who cares? Right? It's not league leading. DeJounte Murray goes from 2 to 1.3 and then back to 1.8. Steals are all over the shop. And they have been that way every single season. It is not to say that good steals players don't remain good steals players. But when you bank on a Z-score in steals and you build your team and you look at it and go, well, this guy got these numbers. Don't. That's why when I use my Durant formula, the weighting on steals is lower because it is not a trustworthy stat game to game or year to year. It is just a lot more random than we would like to admit. So steals and free throws, yet again, for the 4th year in a row, are the most variable statistics year on year. So when you are looking at players and basing your team about what they did on their free throws and their steals the previous season, be cautious. And then throw in 3-point percentage there as well. That is 19 categories. You will notice there is one that I have not talked about. And maybe you know what it is? It's games played. Now you will hear this phrase which really bothers me. The best availability is availability. That's why Harrison Barnes won the MVP. I'm hearing that he didn't. The best ability is ability. The best ability is being available and being good. Right? Being out there as a replacement level player doesn't mean a single thing. It's absolutely irrelevant. Doesn't mean shit. Now, in saying all of that, there's also an idea of, well, past performance with injury predicts future performance. Does it? Because this number here of a correlation of, again, unbelievably weak, 0.23 for games played year on year suggests that it's a little bit random. It's a little bit random. Now, I know that you'll say, well, what about Zion? What about LaMelo? Cool. That's all true. That's all true. What about whoever? But just look at anyone's games played and how their ability to go from 0 to 80. Hey, how about Chet Holmgren, for example? 0, 82, and then what he played this year, 40. What about Brook Lopez? Unbelievable career in terms of looking at where the games are at. Giannis, I think, played 1 million games last season. It is very easy. And you want to base your idea, I just want to draft the guys that are healthy. You know who you don't know is healthy? Anybody. You don't know. You've got no idea. Because most injuries are flukes. Most injuries are unlucky. Now, you know my thoughts. If someone has multiple injuries to the same lower body part, then I am like, yeah, nah, Joel Embiid, I'm actually out because I know that your knee is done because you've had multiple meniscus surgeries and that shit does not grow back. But you will see that a games played correlation of 0. It's still positive. So there is a small amount. There is a small amount of what the games played one year were that correlates to the next year. But the large portion of it is other factors. Randomness. It's not, you played 70 games, therefore you'll play 70 games. You know what people love? Jayson Tatum. I know his per game numbers, but on totals, man, like he's always healthy. Is he? Because he's about to play 0 games this season. Yeah? Man, I've got to draft Ant in the first round because, you know, he's a baller, man. He just loves to play. He's going to be out there. He gets hurt. He comes back out. Yeah, until he doesn't. And you don't know when that'll happen because you have got one of the biggest beacons that explains that to you right in front of you in Jayson Tatum. Every argument, I'll take Jayson Tatum at 6 because I know he's going to be out there. Yeah, and I guess he was last season until the playoffs, but also he's going to get a big fat 0 now because stuff just happens. Injuries happen. Everything when we talk about things, there is always an individual level of context behind every scenario. But the idea that somebody is just... Because you know who's going to get hurt at some point, knock on wood? Mikal Bridges. He is going to miss games. Absolutely guarantee you. It will happen. Although the man just doesn't want any contact at any point, so maybe not. But like, he will miss games. Games played, everything else was at least 0.67. Games played, 0.23. Trying to rely upon games played as a general rule. Well, this guy played this many games last year, therefore it'll happen now. Bad idea. Terrible idea. You will not be successful doing it. The numbers show this year on year on year on year. This is not a one-off fluke. This happens every year. The games played have the most variance out of everything. Do with that what you will. And I will do the end of the show, I guess. Hit the thumb on the video. Tell me what you think about these numbers and how you can use them in your fantasy draft planning. Do that while you're subscribing and thumbing up and all that stuff. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.